We were excited about Breece Hall before the NFL Combine, and now that the Combine is done and dusted, we are even more excited. We're going to talk through some of the reasons why, so let's get straight into it.
And then he has that Combine, right? So he runs just under a 4.4. He has a 40-inch vertical. That combined with some of his peripherals, and if you have any questions about some of those, check out the RotoViz rookie guide. Both Dave Cabin and Blair Andrews have great running back pieces in there. But we know that Hall showed some on-field explosiveness. We know that he had 3 1,000-yard seasons from scrimmage at Iowa State. We know he finished back-to-back 1,700-yard seasons, and yet there was still this question of, can he separate as an athlete at the NFL level? And he can, right? And so immediately now he's up into the top 5 dynasty running backs. He's a better prospect than any of the 3 big names from last season. Now, how is that going to translate into fantasy in the sort of immediate future? We don't know, because we don't know where he's going to land, and we don't know if he's going to have that same kind of workload that elevated Najee Harris up to, that almost 20 point per game expected points, which then you can actually not perform that well and underperform and still be a very good fantasy asset. But Hall as a talent and sort of his window there to be an elite talent is bigger. So then the fun thing you can do, and the exercise I did yesterday for the site, is to pull up the Combine Workout Explorer. This is something that Dave Cabin has put together and will allow you to see the players, some age, height, weight information, and then how they tested at the different Combine drills, where that fits historically, what percentile do those things fall into. But then also he gives you the top 20 athletic comps and how those athletic comps performed in their first 3 years in the NFL. So it really gives you this very well-rounded understanding of how the person performed at the NFL Combine, which is pretty cool, because when we're talking about athletic comps, it gives you an interesting perspective, because these players come from all over the map and they're not necessarily the same guys who were productive in college. And I like to kind of go through this process first by looking purely at the athletic comps, in part because we have this great Combine Workout Explorer, but in part too, because that actually gives you context and reminds you that it's a very different story between the guys who were at one level of athleticism, who were good in college, and those who weren't. And so you tend to get the big names who are drafted early, and then you get everybody else. And at this time of year, that's actually a very valuable exercise to go through, because it does remind you, okay, if the player who just blew up the Combine was not good in college, those players are not jumping out as comps who went on to be good NFL players. And so it can give you a little bit of, I wouldn't say skepticism, but realism in terms of what we're looking at here. But then obviously the cool thing is you do see those big names who are similar in college as producers, and then similar athletes. And that can be kind of fun, right? So the number one name here that jumps out for Breece Hall, and obviously when this name jumps out for you, it really grabs everyone's attention. And that is one Adrian Peterson, right? So with Hall, we have 71 inches height, 217 weight, a 4.39 40-yard dash, 126-inch broad, 40-inch vertical. You compare that to Adrian Peterson, who was just a bit taller, but also 217 at the Combine, runs a 4.4, and then turns in a 127 broad, a 38.5-inch vert. So really almost identical numbers for the mega prospect coming out of Oklahoma, who put up a big rookie season, even though they didn't necessarily intend that. There was a starter on that team who was already very, very good, but then obviously blows up in his second season. One of the things that's interesting there, one of the reasons that I had kind of mentioned Harris earlier, we don't know if Hall will be that level of fantasy performer, is you look back at Adrian Peterson, and despite being one of the 3 or 4 greatest pure rushers to ever play the game, he only crested 20 points per game twice in fantasy. And I say only, it's interesting, again, within context, that his 2,097-yard rushing season in 2012 only averaged 22 points per game. Again, we say only because we've seen quite a few guys get into that 24, 25, 26 point per game range in the last 5 or 6 seasons. And so again, you do have to catch the ball. Adrian Peterson wasn't good at that. I have optimism that Hall will be better. it's always going to be a challenge to break off the number of long highlight runs in the pros that Adrian Peterson did, but Hall now looking very, very good. Some of the other interesting names that do pop out here, you have Cadillac Williams, you have Marshawn Lynch, you have DeMarco Murray, you have someone in Joseph Adai who was drafted very much because of his athleticism. You have Ryan Matthews, who was a top 15 pick and had a solid early part of his career. Colm, these are some big names, and especially, as I mentioned, Adrian Peterson, sort of the headliner. But if you were to perform like a number of these guys, then first of all, you'd be very excited. And secondly, with how rookies are now quickly transitioning to the NFL, and this guy is a very relevant redraft best ball option as well as a dynasty star.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to see. I did see some drafts immediately after the combine when, sometimes it can take a little bit of time for that ADP to settle down, but going, in the second round, quite early in the second round, but we'll see how that does settle. You mentioned some of the names. Adrian Peterson, obviously, it gets the buzz. Marshawn Lynch is in there as well. But the other thing you mentioned in the article is, and we've touched on it a few times, but like we love Jonathan Taylor probably more than most people, and a lot of people do love Jonathan Taylor. And I think that we talk about generational prospects, and I even mentioned earlier in this show about once in a lifetime players like Aaron Rodgers, but I also said that the Packers also had Brett Favre, which is almost once in a lifetime happening twice in a lifetime. So we're obviously talking about generational players. We're talking about Jonathan Taylor, and I think that there still rings very much true. But with Breece Hall, when we start looking into these numbers, when we look at what he did in college, what's the expectation here? Are we looking like how high are we thinking? What's your thoughts, when we're comparing him to, say, a Jonathan Taylor?
Yeah, I think that Hall comes in about halfway in between Taylor and Harris as a prospect. And again, the real advantage that Harris has there is just that they are willing to throw him passes, and he didn't have anybody blocking him. So from a fantasy perspective, he was even better. We don't know if Hall is going to be into that situation. We know that Jonathan Taylor came in and immediately had the Marlon Mack and Hines backfield. And one of the things that cleared the road for him a little bit is that Marlon Mack gets injured. The frustrating thing from this past season is that he really relegated Hines to the sidelines and yet still was in the situation where he didn't catch a lot of passes. Now, I think that's going to take a step forward this year. So he's going to be someone, again, who just always is good in fantasy, but does he have a 25-point season in there sometime? I would hate to think that Jonathan Taylor is going to go through and have a career like Adrian Peterson where he only has 2 20-point per game seasons. Although, again, in some ways that's being greedy even to say we're definitely getting one more, right? Because we know that these running backs go down. But you look at Hall, he's in between those two guys as a prospect. I do think that he's similar and perhaps better than Adrian Peterson because, again, you have that pass catching upside that Peterson just didn't really bring to the table. If you do that with what he is as a rusher, then he's going to be very, very good. And so right now, I think we're all on kind of pins and needles to see where he's going to go in the draft. For all the running backs, it's this question of where will they go in the draft, but especially then once you have someone who has validated himself as, okay, there's going to be no question that he can translate what he did in college to the NFL because he's that kind of athlete, then the excitement for it and the draft and, how that's always Christmas morning. But you're talking about, this is the huge present under the tree, right? When you get this kind of a combine result and you're just hoping that if a team like the Chiefs has a shot at him, that they don't go for, I don't know, this would be the equivalent of like the Chiefs drafting Kyren Williams in the first round instead of Breece Hall, right? So I mean, maybe the Chiefs just go back to the board and take Hall here. Now we know that they have a lot of things to address. They need a third receiver. They have some big parts of their defense who are free agents, but why not? At least you could get it right this time. But I think now, Hall was being projected as late as the 3rd running back overall in some mocks. He was being projected as a late 2nd round pick again in some mocks. You never know, because I didn't think there was any chance that Jonathan Taylor would go into the 2nd round in his draft. But now I think we're looking at some team grabbing Hall in the 20s, and then you're off to the races.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.